Welcome to History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, leave us a comment down below, and share this episode with a fellow history lover. And now, on to tonight's episode. December 25th, 1776, the Delaware River, 8 miles outside of Trenton, New Jersey. General George Washington, fraught with a terrible consternation not only about the treacherous night mission he was now undertaking, but with the whole of the revolutionary desires of the young nation whose future he had been entrusted with preserving. The commander-in-chief and 2,400 of his men set across the icy rivers of the Delaware on that momentous Christmas night in flat ferries and Durham boats, small, well-built vessels designed to bring ore downriver to Philadelphia. With the enlistments of his entire army coming due in just 1 week's time, Washington had staked the fortunes of his men, his new nation, and the actualization of the ideals of the Age of Enlightenment on this one bold and daring quest. A tactical envelopment of the Hessian Mercenaries' winter quarters. If it worked, the American cause could find new life in this bitter war. The iconic Virginian had boiled down the whole of everything riding upon his shoulders that night into 3 simple yet unforgettable words: victory or death. Just 2 months prior, Commander-in-Chief George Washington had arrived with his forces in White Plains, positioning them in a broad defensive line spanning 3 miles. A critical error was made by the American general in placing an inexperienced and undisciplined militia detachment upon Chatterton Hill, the key to the American line. It wasn't until Washington finally decided to examine his entrenchments on the morning of October 28th that he would be informed that the British were advancing upon them. With little time to make adjustments, the Virginian ordered more regiments to the hill with a few pieces of field artillery. When Hessian and British forces moved on the hill, they paid a heavy toll thanks to the American cannonade, but they would quickly turn the tide of the battle and impose their own devastating artillery assault upon the Americans. Then, take their critical high ground position, thus forcing Washington to abandon his lines entirely prior to consuming White Plains and strategically set fires before ceding the town to the Brits and heading north away from the reach of General Howe's forces once again. Because the enlistments of American soldiers in the Continental Army were set for just 12 months, on January 1, 1777, Washington faced the prospect of losing his entire army, devastating any hope of success for the American cause. Washington would write another of what were becoming his voluminous pleas to Congress, petitioning them in as persuasive a manner as he possibly could to delegate further funds towards the recruitment, enlistment, and compensation of a permanent military force that would serve for the duration of the war. The general asked for additional powers to be granted to him, that he have the ability to offer re-enlistment bonuses to current troops, as well as the use of land grants for completed terms of services. Washington penned in his letter that Congress had put far too much stock in patriotism, stating that they feared paying them well would turn them into mercenaries. He professed, "When men are irritated and passions inflamed, they fly hastily and cheerfully to arms, but after the first emotions are over, to expect that they are influenced by any other principles than those of interest is to look for what never did, and I fear never will, happen. The few, therefore, that act upon the principles of disinterestedness are, comparatively speaking, no more than a drop in the ocean. Placing any depends upon such militia is akin to resting upon a broken staff." The commander-in-chief gave an itemized outline of the specific dollar amount, acreage of land, and materials provided that he would require to achieve the necessary army to achieve victory. The disposition of Congress was that the general was bordering on the cusp of securing what could easily become despotic powers. They feared that they would be trading one king for another if they were to grant Washington such singular authority, but they were also aware of what their bleak reality would become were they to lose this fight with the British Empire. They settled on adorning the Virginian with some of his requested powers, including the ability to offer bounties to encourage re-enlistments to selected men, but the abilities were given for terms of just 6 months. Congress also agreed to enlist a new army beginning with the dissolution of the current force, but failed to recognize the inherent difficulties with undertaking such a task for the American military high command and the inexperienced nature of the troops, who would much prefer a 6-week enlistment in the militia over the paltry salary offered by the Continental Army. General Howe would choose not to pursue the Americans further into northern New York after their victory at White Plains, but would instead turn his attention towards the last remaining American stronghold on the island of Manhattan, Fort Washington. The fortification would have been burned and abandoned by the Americans during their retreat from New York City, but Congress demanded it be held as long as possible to prevent British ships from using the Hudson River as a passage north to Lake George. This gave them command of the waterways that could effectively sever New England off from the rest of the nation. The twin forts of Washington and Lee, set across from one another on either side of the Hudson, had been designed to keep this disastrous possibility from coming to fruition. Yet their inability to prevent 3 British ships from passing to the north proved how ineffectual they truly were. Washington would write to Greene on November 8th, "If we cannot prevent vessels from passing up, and the enemy are possessed of the surrounding country, what valuable purpose can it answer to attempt to hold a post which the expected benefit cannot be had?" Washington did not order Greene to evacuate his position at the fort, and Greene would dismiss the concerns the commander-in-chief had expressed, citing a failed attempt to overtake the barriers of the fort on October 27th. The American general arrived to inspect the fort of his namesake on November 12th, and spent 3 days analyzing the men, the structure, and the readiness they held for what would be an inevitable siege attempt by the British. Washington would cross the river and stay at Fort Lee on November 14th, and while he slept, 30 British boats rowed north up the Hudson, past the American fortifications undetected, then entered the Harlem River to the north of Fort Washington. The British general had delivered a message to Greene from King's Bridge. With an incendiary tone, he ordered immediate and total surrender, or face every man being put to the sword. Greene was given just 2 hours to give his answer. He would tell Washington that the troops are in high spirits and they would make a good defense. The attack began on November 16th just after 10 o'clock that morning. A coalition of more than 5,000 British and Hessian troops converged upon the fort from 3 directions. The Americans fought hard. Washington was present within his namesake fort while the attack on the exterior defensive entrenchments got underway. Initially, he felt hope that they would endeavor to repulse the enemy and hold the fort. A German Hessian mercenary would recount the devastating effects of the American rebuttal they endured in the early stages of the battle. "Before us, beside and behind us, we saw our unfortunate comrades lying beside and upon one another. They lay battered and in parts shattered, dead on the earth in their own blood. Some whimpering, looked at us, pleading in one way or another that we would ease their suffering and unbearable pain." In spite of these heavy casualties, the British and German men pressed on until they had driven the Americans back into the walls of Fort Washington. At this time, the American command of Washington, Greene, Putnam, and Mercer evacuated Fort Washington, crossing the river to Fort Lee, and within 30 minutes, the entire structure was completely surrounded. Just after 3 p.m., McGraw surrendered along with 2,800 Americans. Aside from the abhorrent conditions the Continentals would now be subjected to, with many bludgeoned by their German captors, the loss of nearly 3,000 men that day was an astounding failure that directly fell on Washington. Questions about his ability to command the Americans to any semblance of victory grew louder, with some calling for him to be replaced as commander-in-chief. Cornwallis would take Fort Lee just days later. While the 2,000-man garrison managed to evade capture, their equipment and artillery would fall into the hands of the British. Cornwallis would chase the Americans, now just a scant force of 4,000 fatigued, malnourished, and demoralized men, through New Jersey, with Washington leading them to safety in Pennsylvania when Howe again ordered a halt to the British pursuit. The American citizens of eastern New Jersey, who had now fallen under Crown rule once more, faced vicious abuse from the conquering army. Many fled from their homes as refugees to the south to more hospitable lands. On December 11th, Congress convened and ordered a day of fasting and prayer, as the situation for the young nation grew ever more dire by the passing day. They then granted Washington complete authority to carry on the war, and afterwards abandoned Philadelphia and moved their future proceedings to Baltimore. On the 13th, the Continental Army's second-in-command, Major General Charles Lee, was captured in a tavern by 70 British cavalry in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. Lee had ignored Washington's orders to cross the Delaware and join him in Trenton Falls, opting instead for the opportunity to achieve glory and increase his stock with Congress by launching his own attack on the British in New Jersey. Lee had been separated from the main body of his troops, where he was captured with ease and transported to New York City. The following day, after the general was taken into custody, General Howe called an official end to the British campaign season of 1776 and sent his army into winter quarters. Howe would station the men in several detachments throughout town in and around New York City and throughout New Jersey. He felt this separation of forces would be under no threat from the beleaguered Americans who were on their last legs after a devastating summer and fall. American General Joseph Reed wrote the Commander-in-Chief in an attempt to rouse them from their perishing state. "We are all of opinion, my dear General, that something must be attempted to revive our expiring credit, for even a failure cannot be more fatal than to remain in our present situation. Some enterprises must be undertaken in our present circumstances, or we must give up the cause." On December 20th, General Sullivan, who had been captured and then released as part of a prisoner exchange, was able to gather together Lee's men, some 2,000 in total, and trek them through a blizzard to Washington's camp. With this detachment, as well as Horatio Gates' 600 Continentals and 1,000 Philadelphia militia, Washington had under his immediate command a force of over 6,000 men, with little time to make use of them. On the 22nd, a council of war was held with all of the American high command and several officers, one of whom happened to be a Loyalist spy. They listened as Washington presented the locations of all the British and Hessian placements that adorned New Jersey. The target of the assault was not determined during this meeting, and the spy was left with only the concept of an attack to report to the British. Later that night, around only his most trusted officers, the final plan would be set in place. The night that followed Christmas Day, the Americans would cross the Delaware River, then launch their attempt upon Trenton, where Hessian officer Johann Rall and 1,500 mercenaries made their quarters. Washington would cross the Delaware 8 miles north of Trenton at McConkey's Ferry, then turn right, marching through the night to position themselves to the north and east of the Germans. At Trenton, Brigadier General James Ewing would take 600 militia and capture the Assunpink Bridge on the south side of town, preventing the Germans from retreating across it. Colonel John Cadwallader would attack Bristol with 2,400 New England and Pennsylvania militia, undercutting Denope and his men stationed there from reinforcing Rall in Trenton. Washington would then ask General Putnam to gather his militia and follow behind Cadwallader, acting as reserves. Once the orders were given, Washington felt the weight of the daring plan fall heavily upon him as he sat passing the hours on the morning of Christmas Eve in his headquarters. Benjamin Rush would enter his office and see a parchment that the tobacco baron turned commander-in-chief had penned, lying on the floor. It held the Virginians' summation of their shared condition. Rush stared upon the paper and read some of the general's most famous words: "Victory or death." On Christmas Day, the American troops equipped themselves with muskets, cartridges, and flints, some even wrapping their bare feet with ripped cloth, with no shoes or boots to traverse the snow-covered landscape in. They made their way to the Delaware River, where thick blocks of ice had formed as the temperature sank below freezing. A bright moon was muted by the heavy snowfall of the nor'easter that brought with it piercing, howling winds. Colonel Knox was placed in charge of the river crossing, and the hulking, near 300-pound officer was credited with carrying it out under these dire conditions. He oversaw the transport of 18 pieces of artillery and a cavalcade of nervous horses. As the infantrymen made the voyage, some were plunged into the icy stream, but no man was lost amidst the crossing. Washington's chief concern became the extended length of time it took to complete it, with the operation now 3 hours behind schedule. He feared the element of surprise in the nighttime raid could be lost. Once they arrived on the opposite shore, Washington allowed the men to build bonfires to warm themselves, feeling the snowstorm would prevent them from being spotted by the Hessian outposts. A long and toiling march would then get underway, with the Americans trudging through the snow-covered terrain. A scouting party of 40 men, under the command of William Washington, a cousin of the American commander, ran point on the expedition, with orders to catch anyone who crossed their path, be it civilian or soldier. The different American detachments under Roche-Vermont, Sullivan, and Greene blocked every route of escape to the north. Just before daybreak, after 7 o'clock in the morning, after a sleepless night charting a path through the dark and cold, the American line came to a halt. Upon his horse, traveling towards the front of the column, Washington gave a terse, yet measured instruction to his men. "Keep by your officers, for God's sake. Keep by your officers." One loyalist farmer would see the movement of the American troops and head to the Hessians' location. He would attempt to deliver a message to Colonel Johann Rall during a Christmas feast, and the prevailing accounts of what occurred next are that he received the note after much protest from the farmer, placed it in his pocket, and never read it. Another version offers that he was told the Americans were moving to attack, and he responded dismissively, "Let them come." The tension amongst the Patriot troops was palpable, as an uncertain yet determined air permeated their ranks. The snow had turned into a driving sleet and rain as the sun rose on Trenton on the morning of December 26th. The battle that held within it the destiny of the upstart American nation would commence when Greene's division launched an attack on the Hessian outposts, followed immediately with an advance by Sullivan's men, repulsing the German pickets as they fell upon Trenton in concert. The Hessian outposts assumed that these were just loosely assembled American forces coming forth to pester them, as had been the case the last several nights. Those small attacks had been done in an effort to disrupt the sleep of the Hessians in preparation for the large-scale offensive, and when the outposts came to behold the fervor and size of the attack that was upon them, they made an abrupt withdrawal back towards the town. Washington rode to the front of the Virginia Brigade, then led them into the heart of the town, where the Hessians had hastily formed into defensive positions, still attempting to gain their bearings. The Hessians manned their artillery and began offering a heavy fire upon the Americans. Then, the massive Colonel Knox brought an American cannon forward, unleashing a furious bombardment into the concentrated column of German mercenaries. In just minutes, the Europeans began to break ranks and flee into the side streets and fields near the town, as the American cannonade continued to devastate their lines without remorse. The abject violence, chaos, and deafening sound was an overwhelming experience even to the American forces, who took great pleasure in punishing their brutish and bloodthirsty foe. The booming cannons and the sounds of grape shot and musket fire clashing against the stone roads and bridges rang out as a horrid symphony, while the streets of Trenton were painted red with Hessian blood. Colonel Johann Rall gave no indication that he expected this assault, as it took his men 3 attempts to rouse him from his sleep that morning. Rall haphazardly attempted to dress himself as he made his way into the streets of Trenton that morning, attempting to draw together his troops into the town center. Just 2 artillery charges were set off before the Americans fell upon them, forcing the Hessians to abandon them, with another 2 jamming and becoming unusable on the account of their fried-out touchpans. Rall persisted, gathering his remaining men and the regiment of von Lossberg, and commanded them into an apple orchard on the outset of town. The colonel at last managed to formulate that his men were increasingly considering retreat, yet the Hessian colonel quickly found himself ensnared by the Americans as Sullivan had entered Trenton from the west, and Glover had taken the bridge and then marched north, cutting off their last escape route. Johann Rall had no plans of surrender, and made a futile attempt at retaking Trenton, with no artillery, facing an imposing force, multitudes size of their own, and well positioned. Still, the Hessians were resolute in the face of assured death, and marched forward to the tune of their drummer towards the Americans. The final insult in the comedy of errors that was the Hessian rebuttal to the Americans was the driving rains rendering their flint cartridges useless, preventing them from even returning fire. Rall, now upon his horse, was then struck with 2 lethal shots from American muskets, and he slooped forward in his saddle. Upon his demise, his men fled from the battlefield in disorganized desperation. Within minutes, the whole of the remaining Hessian force would throw down their weapons and concede. 650 would manage to escape. 893 would be taken captive, with 22 killed in action, including all 4 Hessian colonels present at the battle, and another 83 men seriously wounded. The Americans suffered 2 deaths from exposure brought about by the night march and 5 men wounded, including future President James Monroe. The Americans would also capture badly needed food, clothing, and medical supplies. The Hessian prisoners would be sent to Philadelphia, and the exhausted yet galvanized Americans retraced their steps back to the Delaware River, crossed its icy waters, and returned to their camp. On the last day of 1776, just before the enlistment of the soldiers of the Continental Army was to expire, George Washington would make an impassioned plea to his men. "My brave fellows, you have done all I have asked you to do, and more than can be reasonably expected. But your country is at stake. Your wives, your houses, and all that you hold dear. You have worn yourselves out with fatigues and hardships, but we know not how to spare you. If you will consent to stay 1 month longer, you will render that service to the cause of liberty and to your country which you can probably never do under any other circumstances." Roughly half of the men who heard Washington's words would agree to stay on. The Battle of Trenton had saved the cause of the American nation, but their war for independence was far from over, as the awakened British Empire would move swiftly to dampen the spirits of the rebellious Continentals. But the many tales of blood and heroism that would follow in the Revolutionary War are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the Join button, or click the link in the description below to become a member on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.